Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Boreal Forests, an ode to the Overstory. And it will be presented by our fabulous Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Eleanor Edye. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you so much, Sunny, and thanks everybody for joining, especially when I know that there is a World Cup semifinal happening at this exact moment. So thanks for tuning in and listening to us talk about the boreal forest today. As Sunny said, my name is Eleanor Edye, and I'm an expedition leader with Nat Hab since 2016. And I have the great fortune of living right on the edge of the boreal forest, and also being an expedition leader on trips that go into the boreal forest, which include all of our Churchill adventures, as well as our Quebec trip. I love the boreal forest very much. I think most Canadians would say the same thing. For a lot of us, it's what we see as our backyard, and it's the place we go to recreate, and it is a really special place. So I hope today that we can increase your appreciation and wonder and understanding for this really special ecosystem, as well as just kind of give an overview and tell some stories about some of the interconnections of the organisms in this, what is really quite fairly pristine habitat that most of us don't get a chance to go into. So starting off, I want to talk about what the boreal forest is, what defines it, where can you find it, because it is a really, really large part of the world's surface. Depending what you read, it's anywhere between 14 and 17% of the total surface of the Earth, of the land surface of the Earth, and it represents 33% of the Earth's forested space overall. So it's a very large part in the global system and the global carbon system, and it has a large part in driving winds and rains and the location of the polar front and all sorts of things that we have affect us, but we don't really think about too much. Of that 14 to 17% of the land surface, which is about 4.7 billion acres, Canada has about a third of that, with the majority of the rest in the Russian Federation and Alaska. And if you look at the EU, the majority of that is in Sweden and Finland. And if you've ever visited there, you know that they are quite forested countries. The majority of Canada actually is considered part of the boreal zone. About 75% of all of Canada's landmass is in the boreal forest zone. But despite that, the majority of our population is not there. So even though that's 3/4 of our land in Canada, only about 10% of the Canadian population lives there. And that typical ratio stays when you look at other countries as well, like the Russian Federation. Of those who live there, many of them live in small remote communities. And across the boreal forest, we know that there are a lot of similar species between North America and Eurasia. We know that this happened because these land masses were connected as recently as 20,000 years ago, but over that 20,000 years since the Bering land bridge has gone under the water, they've had some time to speciate and differentiate. So you see species in North America, like the North American beaver versus the European beaver in Europe. And we have similar ones like that that are analogous, but different enough that we call them different species. Now, before I move on, I just wanted to point out a couple of things about this map. Firstly, this is the boreal forest zone. And if you look at it closely, some things might jump out at you. Firstly, you might notice that Iceland is here completely green in the boreal forest zone. So just because somewhere is in the boreal forest zone doesn't necessarily mean that the trees have had time to catch up to that. Iceland, given time, and if the climate stayed the exact same as it is right now, and there was time for seed dispersal and trees to grow, it would eventually also have a forest on it. Right now, as we know, there's very, very few trees in Iceland. You'll notice as well that Scotland is also marked off as the boreal forest. And if you've seen photos of Scotland or if you've been there, you know it's really well known for its moors and its heaths. And that is, again, an area that's in the boreal forest zone. But there are reasons why Scotland does not have a lot of forest on it, and they're mostly to do with the human impact in that area. Now, last thing I'll say here before we move on is the difference between the boreal forest and taiga. You might hear these words both used. They're meant to be the same thing, but they're not quite used the same way. If you've heard the word taiga before, it's a Russian word and it refers to that northern forest. In North America, we've adopted the word taiga to mean the northern part of that northern forest. So when I'm going to be talking today, I'm going to use the word boreal forest because I'm talking about the entirety of it and not just the northern bits. Know that taiga did have a proper terminology associated with it, but we didn't really take it that way. So onwards, what is the boreal forest and what does it look like? It is beautiful. It's different everywhere you go. It's not one homogeneous forest. It covers a huge part of the planet, but it contains lakes and wetlands and rivers and treeless areas where it's at elevation and bogs and peatlands and different species of trees. When I look at this photo, I think a couple of things. I think, hey, firstly, this looks very, very Canadian. This looks like what I want as my backyard. I want to go camping and canoeing there. But I also know from my experiences in the boreal forest that if I were to go there in the summer, it would likely be quite a buggy area. It looks very different in the boreal forest if you go north or south. So there are transitional zones. One of the things that happens at higher elevations is that you get more and more wetlands. So this map here is just a map of where wetlands of the world are located. And if you look at North America, you can see that it's quite colored in the greens and in the purples. And those green colors are actually showing us areas where the land is either more than 50% wet or 25 to 50% wetland or 50 to 100% wetland. So here we're really seeing that some parts of the forest there, we're calling them forests and they might have trees on them, but they're also incredibly wet with likely a lot of peat development happening there. And these wetlands are how the boreal forest stores more carbon than any of the other world's forests. So it stores more carbon than the temperate and tropical forests combined. If you were to go south from the boreal forest, you don't step into the prairies right away. There are transitional zones depending where you are on the planet. In my neck of the woods, as you move out of the boreal forest, you move into an area called aspen parkland, where it's just an area that's dominated by deciduous trees like aspen and poplar. If you are on the east coast of North America, around Vermont, for example, you're going to have that transition from boreal forest into that hardwood and beautiful maple forests. And if you are going into a mountainous area or into the southwest where we cross into the Rockies, you'll instead transition into subalpine forest. And this is a photo from the Canadian Rockies here. And you can see how the forest is getting less and less as it moves up the mountain to a point where trees can't grow anymore at altitude. And then to the far north, kind of no matter where you are in the boreal forest, whether you're in North America or in Eurasia, you're going to encounter something called forest tundra, where you slowly get fewer and fewer trees, and those trees are more and more stressed and less able to reproduce and less able to grow upright or to grow very much at all. And you start to have more and more treeless expanses of tundra within those trees. And you might have little patches of trees like you can see here with area of tundra out on the left-hand side of this image, or it might be a little more intermixed. It varies depending what the local conditions are, but it's that transition from a closed forest to an open forest to a tundra where there's no trees at all. So a lot of space that this covers, a lot of different habitat, like smaller habitats. And while I'm talking, I'm going to be focusing more on the North American boreal forest because that is what I personally have more experience in. But you can know that the boreal forest is it's called a circumboreal ecosystem. So it wraps all the way around the northern part of the planet, and it is considered a single ecosystem. While there may be different species, for example, there's different species of larch, from North America to South America, North America to Eurasia. There's different species of beaver from North America to Eurasia. They all fill that same niche within the ecosystem. So with that, I want to start getting into what you would see in the boreal forest and what starts going into the building blocks to making this really special place. And I want to start by talking about the trees, because as we go, we'll get the sense here how the trees set the stage for everything else that comes after. None of the animals that we're going to talk about could be here without these trees. The trees set the stage, they make the forest, and they are very, very good at keeping the forest the same year over year and generation over generation. So there are very few dominant tree species of the boreal forest. We can divide them into broad groups like larch, spruce, fir. They're all adapted to fire, and they're all adapted to cold. Within these regions, the growing season varies from around 80 days, it's not very long at all, to around 130 days in the warmer southern regions. Being adapted to cold also means that they have to be adapted to low water availability. If you're a spruce tree growing in the forest and you've got 6 feet of snow all around you, that's great. Eventually it's going to melt and be available water, but you have to spend a large part of your year still with your needles on, still exposed to the sunlight, when all of the water around you is unavailable. It's in a frozen state. So this tree that we can see here is a white spruce. It's one of the dominant, really the dominant spruce in North America. It's one of the ways that it's so well adapted to being at the boreal forest is the waxy covering on the needles. And if you spent any time traveling north or south, you might have seen spruce in different areas. You might have noticed sometimes that spruce are slightly different colors when you go different places, and you might say to yourself, why is a white spruce kind of green here? And why is a white spruce kind of blue over here? I don't understand. Why isn't this tree the same color? Well, like other spruces, the white spruce has a layer of wax around its needles that protects against both extreme heat and extreme cold, along with water loss. But as that wax gets thicker and thicker and thicker, as conditions get harsher and harsher, the wax on top of those needles actually lets less light through, making the chlorophyll inside those needles look bluish. So you know that when you see a bluish spruce, that it is quite a hardy plant adapted for some very harsh conditions. Firs are another type of tree that you find in the boreal forest. Most of the trees, but not all that you find within the boreal forest, are conifers, which are generally evergreen trees. They're like the Christmas trees that you find that usually have cones on them. You can tell it's a fir as opposed to a spruce by how their needles are arranged on the twig. So they're kind of flat, and at the base of the twig, it looks like a little suction cup. That one there is a balsam fir. We also have the pines. This one coming up here is a jack pine. Pines are fairly nice in that you can always tell it's a pine because when you look at the needles come in clusters, and they come in clusters of between 2 and 5 needles. Jack pine is a 2-needle pine. And on the right-hand side there, you can see some of the young cones developing. Spruce, pine, fir, all of these conifers, or most of the conifers, I should say, all produce both male and female cones. These are male cones on this jack pine. These are the ones that produce the pollen that gets up your nose, that makes you sneeze in the spring. And they produce so much pollen that when you go into the boreal forest in the springtime, the lakes are often on a still day just covered in this layer of yellow. And that is the spruce pollen or pine pollen going around. Many people's favorite tree in the boreal forest is the tamarack, also called the larch. In North America, it's not the dominant species. We do find it in various places, but it is the dominant species in Siberia. In fact, it's the only species at the tree line in Siberia, and it has a tremendous effect as a keystone species there, where its decomposed leaves are the only leaves that's making up the soil. All the rodent populations, all the bird populations depend on its seed, and none of those other animals can be there without that single one tamarack or larch species. You know it's a larch or a tamarack. These are our only deciduous evergreens. So this is a picture of one in the fall where it's turning yellow and it's going to be losing its leaves over the coming weeks. The last big group of plants that we have, or trees that we have in the boreal forest, are the poplars. This can include trees like this one, the balsam poplar, but also the trembling aspen, the cottonwoods, the black poplar is another name for this one, birch. So these are all part of the birch family here, and they are more found in the southern part of the boreal forest, but we do see them going straight through to the north as well. They're just less of a presence as we move further north. That's pretty much it for the trees in the boreal forest. 14% of the land surface of the earth is these tree groups, and that's it. So you can now impress your friends and say that you know all the trees of the boreal forest, which is great. And these species have been associated with each other as part of this kind of cohesive ecosystem as far back as we can track using pollen data. As the last ice sheets receded from North America, and here we're just looking at an image here of the location of pine, spruce, birch, and grass species as those ice sheets move northward over time. And you can see that the pine, the spruce, and the birch are always just lockstep, moving with each other, following that receding ice edge as it has moved over thousands of years. Moving forward in time, we're looking now at present day on the right-hand side and going back to 9,000 years before present. Again, that pine, spruce, and birch just stay right there together. As the ice has left North America and Siberia, the boreal forest has followed. The boreal forest, as we see it today, is a youngish forest because the land hasn't been uncovered by ice for that long, but it's always been that same kind of forest. And it's moved in that exact same way. You get your lichens forming first, then your mosses, holding moisture so that different seeds can grow, and then we start getting the birch, the willow, the aspen, the pine, and the spruce moving in, all following the natural cycles of wind and rain, as well as migration of people going up that way as well, also bringing seeds along with them as they followed that ice edge. Real quick look at the soils. They're not very good. If you've ever tried to grow flowers under a spruce tree or a pine tree, you'll know it's very, very challenging. The soils that had been there before the ice sheet all got pushed away, and the soils have been developing and growing as those trees have moved in. They're very, very shallow. They're very, very acidic, and there's very few nutrients within the soils themselves. What we see underneath those trees, there are understory shrubs, predominantly from the heath family, which includes things like sheep laurel, blueberry, cranberries, Labrador tea. But there may be mosses and lichens as well, and there can be some other smaller trees like willows as well. Lots and lots of berries, lots of berry pickings that happen here. Now, hold on to your hats and hold all of this in your head, because what we're going to do now is talk about the animals within the boreal forest, all of which only get to exist there because of those exact species of trees that we've talked about and the exact system and ecosystem processes that we've touched on already. So we can't go through all the species in the boreal forest. Just in Canada, we have 85 species of mammal, 130 species of fish, 325 species of birds, and an estimated 30,000 or so species of insects. That sounds like a lot, and it's certainly too much to talk about within an hour. But if you think about, again, the landmass that we're talking about, that's a tremendously small number of species for that size of an area. And all of these species are highly specialized and adapted to life in the boreal, meaning that harsh winter followed by a very short summer. So let's talk about some of these, and we're going to focus in on the ones that I think are some of the most interesting, as well as talk about the ecosystem processes that allows them to be there. So the first thing we're going to talk about is fire. And I know that many people who sign in are from North America, and in North America, I think in the last 5 years or so, we've had some really big fire years, and it's been something that maybe you haven't had to be aware of in the past, but a lot of summer days recently, we've had very smoky skies, and we've been very aware of fires happening. And if you've gone to the trouble of looking at where these fires are, they are generally in the forests and more than likely in the boreal forest. Now, these fires are normal to a point for the boreal forest. The boreal forest is what we call a fire adapted ecosystem. Because of those accumulations of carbon stored in the peats, because of the coniferous trees with all that fuel and their resin, which is just ready to burn, any lightning strikes that happen when there are dry conditions can spark fires. And the natural fire cycle of the boreal forest in Canada is on average around 75 to 100 years, meaning that we never really see forest stands older than 100 years throughout much of our forest. Each region has a slightly different fire cycle. If you look at the further northern areas where it's really wet and waterlogged, they might have a fire cycle of more like 300 years. So they might have stands of spruce that are 300 years old, whereas in my neck of the woods, or if you visit like Jasper, for example, right on the edge of the boreal forest as it goes into the montane forest, it's going to burn every 75 to 100 years because that's what it does. Now, this is problematic more for humans than for anybody else. We've been doing a good job over the last, the 20th century in really controlling fires, leading to a lot of old standing wood that was over ready to burn, meaning that a lot of fires that have been happening have been larger than normal and less easily controlled because they're just so ready to go up in flames. But it's not all bad, and because the boreal forest is adapted to a fire cycle, it's not just the trees that need this, it's the animals, some of the animals as well. So for our trees, there's a few ways that this helps them out. So all of the trees, all of those tree groupings that we talked about are fire adapted, and they're fire adapted in a few different ways. One of the ways, remember I showed you that picture of the soil, very few nutrients in the soil. Well, if you're a young tree looking to grow, how are you going to actually obtain those nutrients to grow? Well, one of the ways that nutrients get back into the ground is by fire. And that is how it feeds into the microbiome and how it feeds back into the overstory growth. These cones that you can see here are jack pine cones. And if you look at them, I don't know how much time you spent looking at spruce cones or at pine cones. These ones are sealed up, meaning that the seeds are still inside them. And different species of the boreal forest have different requirements for what their cones need to open up and release the seeds. There are some species where if you just leave them on the ground long enough, eventually the wax that keeps those seeds inside will degrade and will let those seeds out. There's some, and we'll talk about in a bit, that are mostly foraged, and so they rely on their seeds being scattered by other animals. Jack pine, along with a number of other species as well, for example, black spruce, requires fire to disperse its seed. So if you're a jack pine and you're growing over 75 or 100 years, you're making your cones every 2 to 6 years, and you're dropping them on the forest floor, they're mostly just going to stay there. They might be scavenged by squirrels or other animals, but they're mostly going to be lying on the soil, waiting for a fire to come through and melt that wax that's holding those seeds in place. And jack pines are one of the first trees to come back after a fire in areas where jack pines are, because they have so many seeds that are just holding on and waiting for a chance to grow. And after a fire, you can see a stand like this. So this is a post-fire stand about 3 or 4 years after a fire. This is located in the province of Alberta. And this is a good looking stand. If you look at it from the perspective of, forests must be intact and must always have standing trees to be a forest, well, it's not going to look so good to you. But for the boreal forest, this is all part and parcel of what it has to be. So I can see here that we've got a lot of pine starting to regenerate. We also have a lot of ground shrubs that are growing, and post-fire stands are well known as a good place to go berry picking about 5 to 6 years after a fire comes through. And if there's a lot of wood standing around the outside, one of the first things that can come back along with the jack pine is actually species like the trembling aspen, which have the ability to reproduce not just from seeds, but also from lateral suckers that they will send out underneath the ground and then pop up a new tree. So if you burn an area and you haven't burned all the way through the soil, you're going to have aspen popping up very, very quickly, just cloning themselves from close by trees. So all this standing deadwood that you can see here, all these burned out trees, in human terms, we also often see this as something that's a waste if we don't go in and harvest it. And many companies and many people will go in and harvest these for personal use or for commercial use. But in fact, because this is a fire adapted ecosystem, this post-fire area is actually critical habitat for other species. One of which is this bird here. This is the black-backed woodpecker. So it's found throughout the boreal as well as throughout some of the subalpine forest. And if you look at the range map, it looks like it's found all the way through the boreal, and yeah, it kind of is, but not really, because it really only lives in recently burned areas or areas where there have been a lot of insect infestation. If a burned area is salvage logged, meaning that people have come in and removed all that standing deadwood, you have then removed habitat for these black-backed woodpeckers. They only really are able to feed in areas that are post-burn, where they come in and eat the insects that are also using that standing deadwood as food. So after a fire, you have about 8 years where that stand is suitable habitat for a black-backed woodpecker. And then they're going to have to go on and find a new burned area. So they do require those burns, and there are other bird species as well that have similar life histories to these guys. So it seems odd sometimes when we think about it from a human perspective that fires are required, but there we go. Okay, so with that, let's move on and talk about some other species that also use some critical habitat and what that looks like. So I think a frequent crowd pleaser is the woodland caribou, also sometimes known as reindeer, depending where you are. In North America, this here is their distribution map. There are different subspecies of caribou. The woodland caribou is the one found within the northern range of the boreal forest. And they, as you can imagine, have to do a lot of feeding through the snow. So they are part of the deer family. They are the only member of the deer family where the males and females have antlers. And they require also very specific habitats. So while our bird, like the black-backed woodpecker, required recently burned areas, the woodland caribou requires about as old of a forest as you can get, because their food source is big fluffy lichens that grows on the ground of a very, very mature spruce forest. That's it. That's all they're going for. They're looking for lichen. They need old growth spruce. And so for them, they're waiting for that stand that hasn't had disturbance to be ready for their feeding. They're very, very skittish animals. They don't like being around people. They don't like roads. This is looks like a very busy photo, but this is an example of their ideal habitat. So we've got some standing spruce, we've got some standing deadwood, because it's a very, very old forest that hasn't burned for a long time, probably at least least a couple hundred years, and you can see those white tufts on the ground. That is not snow, that is lichen, and that is the food source for those caribou. Now, if you're thinking about being a caribou, look at this. I'm saying this is great habitats. Their lichen is on the ground. It's going to be covered in snow. How are they going to find that lichen in the winter underneath that snowpack without wasting a lot of effort to get there? Well, caribou have a special strip within their eyes called the tapetum lucidum. You might be aware of it a little bit. We don't have it as humans, but some other animals do, like dogs and cats. If you've ever seen that flash of light inside your dog or cat's eye and maybe startled you at night, that is that same layer within that eye. And what that does is it actually absorbs light and reflects it back into the retina. It's found mainly in nocturnal species as well as predatory mammals that hunt at night. But if you think about it, it's quite valuable for caribou because they live in an area where they have to forage for food in long periods of darkness. And another thing that caribou have that helps them out with that is that they can see light in the UV spectrum, meaning that the lichens that you can see here, it's the same kind of lichen, it's a type of reindeer lichen, well, actually fluoresces in UV light. So the best guess right now is that caribou are actually able to see lichens underneath the snowpack so that they are able to best know where to forage without wasting energy. There's a lot of cool stuff about the caribou, but I think that that's one of the coolest things. Another crowd pleaser, it's one of my favorites, is the moose. I have a lot of moose close to me and they're always kind of scary, but I like them anyway. If you're European, you will know this by the name of elk. We call elk something else in North America, and this is our moose. So they're also in the deer family. And a note about the deer, white-tailed deer as well as mule deer are also in the boreal forest, but I figure everybody knows about them and they're found everywhere anyway, so I'm not going to talk about them. The moose, though, the moose requires, again, very specific habitat within the boreal. So they are browsing herbivores, meaning that they very carefully select what kind of food they need. And your average adult moose needs to eat 23,000 calories per day. That's for an average 800-pound animal to maintain its body weight. And they get it mostly from fresh tree shoots, so they like willow and birch, and they like aquatic plants. And that's about it. So they are very highly specialized for life in the more soggy parts of the boreal forest, in those wetland areas. Really interesting fact about the moose, they can actually feed up to 15 feet underwater. Their nostrils can close when they are underwater, which is why it's often shocking, and it still shocks me to know that one of their known predators of the moose, you might think, okay, bear, wolf, maybe coyote, maybe wolverine, I don't know. It's actually the orca, because they have been known to be hunted on the coastal areas by orca. So yeah, these guys, they like previously burned areas because that tends to grow the type of high nutrient food that they need, and they like it to be wet. So again, very large forest area, but very specific needs of that one animal within the forest. One of the predators of both the moose and the caribou, as well as our elk and other species of deer, is the wolf, the gray wolf, if you want to get particular about it. So the wolves are really interesting, and I just want to touch on them a little bit because they were once found in the circumboreal area, but humans have removed wolves from an awful lot of areas. And I mentioned before on that range map how the boreal forest includes Scotland, and how you probably haven't noticed a lot of boreal forest in Scotland recently. Well, there's two main reasons for why you don't find trees in Scotland anymore. One is the Napoleonic Wars required a lot of timber harvesting to feed the war machine. The second reason is that we went and killed all the wolves, and that allowed deer to increase in number, as well as bringing in sheep to browse, to the point where any tree seedlings that grow just get eaten by herbivores. So there's some really interesting remediation efforts going on with reintroducing predators, but also removing deer to allow trees to grow. But it's really bizarre to think about how Scotland as we know it has not been an untreed area for very long at all. Oh, I just keep bringing up favorites. The Canada lynx. How can this not be a favorite? It's a big cat with giant feet, so it looks like it's wearing snowshoes. The lynx is a really special animal, and it's a really odd one. You may know, if you've ever taken an ecology course, that the lynx is a very cyclical animal in terms of its population. So the populations will grow, they'll have lots of kits, and then the populations will crash. And they closely follow the cycle of the snowshoe hare, because that is really pretty much their only prey animal. So when snowshoe hare numbers are high, lynx numbers are high. When snowshoe hare numbers are low, lynx numbers are low. And they go up and down in a very, very defined cycle. The hare feeds on forest plants in relatively new areas. So they, again, like areas that are post-burn, but a ways post-burn. And there's interesting new research. We used to think that the population cycled because the hares would eat out all of their food. So they would outgrow, their population would outgrow what they could feed themselves on. But it turns out the lynx has actually been the driving factor in these cycles, and that the lynx just make too many lynx, and then they eat all their prey, and there isn't enough prey left, so then the lynx population crashes, and then the snowshoe hare population can rebound. So they will always be in lockstep, these animals, and they never step outside of it. Now, the beaver is also known as the engineer of the forest. I'm not going to talk about the beaver too much because I actually did a whole webinar on the beaver a while back. They're endlessly interesting. They are major drivers of the forest and actually have a huge, huge role in maintaining that fire cycle of the forest. One of the ways they do that is by building their dams and making wetlands. Because when you make a wetland, and beavers are really, really good at making wetlands, fires are less able to move across that wetland to spread further. So when you have beavers in an area, your areas that are burned tend to be burned in a smaller area, and the fires tend to be less severe because the ground holds more moisture at that time. Now, one of the interesting things happening with the beaver right now is that they are kind of expanding beyond the boreal forest. They've always been found within North America. They've been kind of out hunted in a lot of areas in the south of North America. But they are actually finding their way north, and they are expanding into the tundra as temperatures warm. So it will be interesting, really interesting to me to see how much of an influence the beavers are going to have in that new habitat for them as time goes on. Now, this little guy is the American red squirrel. Related species in Eurasia would be the red squirrel. These guys, believe it or not, are highly dependent on the trees of the boreal forest, specifically the white spruce. It's a tough life to be a red squirrel. You don't even get to hibernate. You got to keep going year round. And their survival rate is only 50% in any given year, so half the population dies every single year. For every single little squirrel, it takes them 1 hectare of trees to get them through the winter. So a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters. And because these guys are such voracious consumers of seeds, it's why we think, one of the reasons why spruce, especially, which is their main food source, has developed a phenomenon called mast years, which is synchronous mass production of cones. So if you ever find yourself in the forest and you look at the trees and you think, gosh, I haven't seen a pine cone for a long time, that's actually pretty normal. Depending on the species and where you are, they might only produce cones in a big number every 5 to 6 years or so, because by producing a lot of cones all at once, they can get ahead of the squirrels and actually produce more seeds than will be eaten. In North America, for these red squirrels, more than 50% of their diet is white spruce seeds. So they eat some other stuff as well, but they are highly, highly reliant on those white spruce seeds. And they will actually have a part as well in generating the next generation of trees, because they will collect the cones, they will bury them underground, and then they will cache it and then go back and eat it throughout the winter. They will sometimes forget about a cache, or they will die before they use up the whole cache, or they will miss a couple of seeds, and that then becomes a seed repository for next time a fire goes through. So sometimes as well, you'll see a big chunk of white spruce growing up. You're like, what is going on here? That was probably where a spruce buried a whole bunch of seeds and didn't come back for it. Now, if you've ever traveled with us to Churchill, if you spent any time in the forest, you may have seen this little guy here. This is the Canada jay. Had a photo of this on our opening page as well. In Eurasia, they have the close relative, the Siberian jay, which takes up their niche over there. So as you can see, their range really fully overlaps the boreal forest, as well as some areas of subalpine forest. Basically, they live where the spruce is. They require spruce with its specific kind of flaky bark to use as a cache for their food over the winter. So they will actually collect up meat, berries, anything that, like, they're not picky about what they eat, these birds. Dog food, piece of your sandwich if they can get it, and they will actually lift up little pieces of the bark and put their food underneath, so it sits within the bark of the tree, where it's actually going to be preserved by the natural antiseptic properties of spruce, in combination with the fact that it's quite cold. So they're one of the only birds that lives in the boreal forest year-round. They're very, very charming birds. They tend to be quite bold around humans. And next photo here is just of a couple of jays caching food. So they'll cache within those spruce trees, and again, they are where the spruce are. If there are no spruce, there are no jays. One of the other year-round birds of the boreal forest is the spruce grouse. It only occurs with spruce and fir and tamarack stands, and they like areas that have been burned within the last 20 to 40 years. So they like it when new growth is happening, but not a fresh burn. They like the extra shrubs in those areas. Remember that we saw that photo of the burned area, how it was really shrubby on the ground. They like the ground cover so they can be covered up, and then they can also feed off the spruce as it's starting to grow back. So they are quite well adapted to that patchwork landscape of the boreal forest. These next birds coming up, one is a permanent resident. The boreal chickadee is on the left. Much like the Canada jay, they also cache food within spruce trees for use in the winter, but they actually are much more picky about what they eat. They are insectivores, so they will cache spiders and other insects, as well as pupae and insect eggs within the spruce bark. Yeah, pretty yummy, right? This other bird on the right is also an insectivore, but this one here is one of the seasonal migrants. This is a tree swallow. And the boreal forest in North America really is a bird nursery. There are around 325 species of migratory birds that will go to the boreal forest throughout the summer for their feeding and for their breeding. And those 325 species represent around 3 to 5 billion birds every year that will migrate. This is often the smaller songbirds that we know of that we see at our feeders sometimes, but we also include our waterfowl that come up to use all those lakes and rivers up there too. So just another one there for you. This is another migratory bird that comes up. The rusty blackbird is another insectivorous bird. And guess what? It's picky about where it lives. It only breeds in wet forests. So it has to have beaver ponds, and wet, a very wet forest for it to be around. So they're rare birds, probably because they are so picky about where they live. Now, if you're wondering about how insects survive the winter in the boreal forest, there's a variety of strategies. Many of them will overwinter as eggs that are a lot more hardened to survive the cold temperatures. But another way that you can overwinter if you're a bug is to overwinter within the mosses on the forest floor. This moss, for example, the woolly fringe moss, can keep temperatures up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the surrounding area, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. About 40 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding air. And because of things like this, we actually have mosquitoes that will overwinter as adults within the snowpack under these mosses, so that the moment that it's warm enough for that mosquito to fly and try and eat you, they emerge very, very early in the spring, usually in early April. It is a land of bugs, I will say that. And some of these bugs are pests for humans, but some of them are quite damaging to the forest themselves. So insect disturbance is definitely something that we see within the boreal forest. This here is the eastern spruce budworm. It is a known, we call it a pest because that's how we see it, of the boreal forest. They come in cycles of about 30 to 40 years. So every 30 to 40 years, we will have tens of millions of hectares that will be defoliated, and an outbreak will likely last several years. They have a whole life cycle that comes into, there's always some spruce budworm around, but they reach outbreak levels around that 30 to 40 year mark. Yeah, the causes of the outbreaks are still debated, but it's been happening as long as we know. And one of the reasons that we know it's been happening for a long time is that there are, guess what, bird species who exist entirely on spruce budworm. One of these is the Cape May warbler, and these subsist chiefly on the spruce budworm. And in fact, you would consider them to be a spruce budworm specialist, as their populations will cycle with the spruce budworm, increasing when the spruce budworm increases and decreasing at other times. They can survive on other insects like spiders and flies and what have you, but they specialize completely on the spruce budworm. And there are a couple of other warblers that do that as well. So as well as the Cape May warbler, the bay-breasted warbler, and the Tennessee warbler will also migrate into the boreal forest specifically for those spruce budworm outbreaks. So while we may think of it as, terrible and damaging, and we see the forest being hurt by these bugs, and there's been lots of times where governments have tried to reduce the amount of budworms, we also know that it again forms critical habitat for other species. So that's a lot that we've talked about. Before we wrap up, there's a few other things I wanted to just kind of bring in, and that is some of the challenges that the boreal forest is facing these days. Talked earlier about fire, and I think most of us in North America have been much more aware of the bad fire years that we've had in the last 10 years or so, because while fire is a normal part of the boreal forest life cycle, it really and truly is, we've seen a lot of very large and intense fires in the past 10 to 20 years. Some of this is because of human impact, right? We have kept fires away and we've created these old, dense, very ready to burn stands. But also human-caused climate change have caused temperatures to be warmer and drier in the summer, leading the way for fires to just get bigger because there's been less mitigating factors to slow it down. So this here is an example of a fire that happened, I think it was back in 2015, in Wood Buffalo National Park, where the fire was actually so intense that it burned the seeds within the soil, and it burned all of the organic matter within the soil as well. And you can see that there's also very little standing dead wood. everything just got burned, and years later, we're still not seeing this regenerate to a forest because it just got knocked so far back. So there are ecosystem processes that are struggling with changes in temperature. And we know that something like this will simply not regenerate back to a forest on the time scale that we want to see, or that animals that depend on the boreal forest need to see. This particular area might remain as non-forest for decades if it ever returns to being a forest. It's got a long way back to go here. I don't know if you noticed my subtitle at the beginning. It was the Boreal Forest, an ode to the Overstory, or why I hope that we'll all be choosing recycled toilet paper from here on in. Because one of the other challenges facing the boreal forest is kind of the human impact on existing habitat and the pristine natural stands that we have. So Canada is a major exporter of wood and wood products. We log in Canada about 0.5% of our total boreal forest cover every year. And 90% of that is exported to the US mostly for pulp and wood products. It doesn't sound like a lot, but that means that we're cutting down our whole forest for wood and for paper every 200 years on average. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's worse than it is, because I will tell you, we have gotten much, much better at doing this ethically and sustainably. And this here is an example of a clear cut from Ontario. This is how it's done now. Very different than how it would have been done in the past. If you look at it, you can see that there's a stream in the lower left-hand portion of the image. They've left a riparian corridor around the stream so that the quality of the water is not affected. We've also left patches of trees, and there's a lot of edge, so that as that forest regenerates, like, they're going to come in and plant trees, but they're also going to have the seed bank and the trees surrounding, also aiding in regeneration. So it's much, much better forest harvesting than we've done in the past. But because we're facing so many challenges from climate change and out of control fires, I'm personally of the opinion that it behooves us to kind of preserve as much habitat as we can. And I'm personally have to look at this every so often and remind myself why it's so important for us to make sure that at every opportunity possible, we're not using virgin forest to create our paper. There's lots of good ways of recycling paper, and I think that getting recycled toilet paper is a great way for pulp to end its life cycle throughout the recycling process. Because we've seen just a little snapshot of these beautiful animals and these intact ecosystems, and we can see how, just talking about a few of these hundreds of species, we can see how reliant all of them are on each other and the processes that happen. It's really something to marvel at and just remain in awe of, I think. So I'll leave you with the picture here of what I see out my window when it's not snowing crazy heavily. I sure do love the forests, and I hope that you get a chance to see the boreal forest someday if you haven't already, and that it touches your heart the way it's touched mine. With that, I'll hand things over for questions.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I always enjoy your presentations and learn so much. Before we start the Q&A, I would like to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. But let's go ahead and get started. You had mentioned a little bit about this, and I wonder if you could just recap for our audience. The question is, in the past, were Iceland and Scotland forested, and did man deforest them?
Yes. So unfortunately, yes, the answer is yes. Scotland was forested. Man did deforest it, and then we created a situation where the forest was not able to regenerate itself because of the overabundance of browsing animals in that location. Iceland, believe it or not, actually used to have not a lot of trees, let's keep that clear, but Iceland did have a number of trees that were regaining a foothold as As the ice receded and as, I always think it's kind of funny to think of the wood marching northward, right? The wood has to get there by way of seed, but seeds were making their way to Iceland like they do on the backs of birds or on the wind. And there were some forest patches in Iceland, and they were actually all cut down by the Viking colonies that were established there around 1200 years ago.
Fascinating. So here's a switch in topic. Are Kirtland's warblers found in the Canadian boreal jack pine forest? In the US, this warbler is threatened and has been heavily managed in jack pine forests. Kirtland's warblers.
Yeah, that isn't one that I'm familiar with, so it tells me that's okay. Full disclosure, me and warblers sometimes have a hard time, especially in the fall. But I'm not familiar with that species, which tells me that it's likely not where I am at the very least. Doesn't mean that it's not elsewhere in the boreal forest, but that is one that I would have to look up to give you a definitive answer.
Okay. And you also touched on this, the relationship between orcas and moose. Can you go into a little bit more depth about how the orcas hunt the moose and how far out to sea or how close to shore that might occur?
I love that this is what's stuck in people's heads, because it's the first time I read that I thought it was not true, right? Who would have thought that when doing investigations on orca diet, they would have found moose in an orca's stomach? But if you think about it, it sort of makes sense, right? The boreal forest extends coast to coast. Most of the moose live inland because that's where most of the habitat is, but there are moose that exist on the coasts as well, both along the coast of Hudson Bay and along the east and west coast of Canada. Those moose will browse, as they do in wetlands. In most areas, this is freshwater wetlands, but it actually will include coastal wetlands. They actually quite prefer salty vegetation when they can get their mouths on salty vegetation. So they will go into those coastal wetlands, and they are, as mentioned, able to dive down around 15 feet. They don't go very far out, so they'll be within those, the general coastal area. But if you've ever seen videos of orcas hunting, and I strongly suggest that you go look this up if you haven't already, because it's kind of terrifying. Those orca populations that are specialized to feed on marine mammals, they don't really differentiate in taste between a seal and a moose if it's something they can get to. So if you have a moose who's browsing on kelp one day within the coast, and there's an orca population there, that's a marine mammal feeder, they will hunt it just like the sea wolves that they are. And it's pretty extreme, those guys. Yeah. I should say it's not a main food source of an orca. Yeah. Seals and sea lion, like they'll always make up more of a food source of those mammal eating orcas, but moose makes their way in there as well.
Well, we only have time for one more question, so I'll throw this one out for you. Are mycorrhizal fungi a major factor in boreal forest health?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I didn't even get into the mycorrhizal network because we've only got so much time, and it kind of deserves its own webinar, actually. But absolutely. So we know within the boreal forest that our stands of trees, they are able to transfer nutrients back and forth. They are able to communicate using the mycorrhizal network. So for those who might not know, the mycorrhizae are the filamentous fungus that lives within the soil and actually makes up a large portion of the weight of a soil. Those are often connected to tree roots, and they're used both for increasing the absorption of tree roots and actually connecting trees to each other within the forest. And it's one of the reasons that whether we're looking at a clear cut done by logging or we're looking at a forest fire, it's one of the reasons that having patches of intact forests, like with a lot of edges, is really important, because then the soil, like the mycorrhizae, are able to grow back into that burned area or into that clear-cut area as well. And if you've ever, you've probably heard about tree planters, like when an area is logged, they will send people out to replant trees within that logged area. Every single tree that goes in there is sent out having been dipped into mycorrhizal spores. So they're already getting their little start in life, ready to colonize that new area with that fungus. Because without the fungus, I mean, that really holds it all together. We're talking about the trees, but the fungus really supports the trees. So great question, and thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again. I'm going to turn it back to you for any closing comments you might have.
Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. I'll just give a quick plug for Friday's webinar if you're interested in more animals of the boreal forest, because Edye's going to be talking about bear hibernation, and now is a straight on into bear hibernation season. So thanks again, everybody, and hope you have a great day.
I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everybody.